Okay, and it says recording in progress. And I'm in control of the participants.
Yes.
Yes, I am. They're coming in. We have attendees still joining. Maybe after another minute, we should start. All right, we have a good number of attendees. Is it time to start?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good evening if you're in Japan. Good morning if, sorry, other way around. Good morning if you're in Japan. Good evening if you're in the US. Good day if you're anywhere else in the world. My name is Cade Mosley. I'm the Advocacy Officer for Human Rights Now. And this is our event on an import ban on products of forced labor. And we have three panelists we're going to speak about. So first of all, let me just introduce a little about who we are and this event and a few rules about the event. So our NGO is Human Rights Now. We're a Tokyo-based international human rights NGO. We focus on a lot of different, our focus is the Asia region, but we focus on a lot of different issues like women's rights, children's rights, armed conflict and human rights, but especially for this project, business and human rights. We were founded in 2006, so we've been around for a while. And so, first of all, I just want to go over a few things about how this event will go. So we have three panelists. This is the program. So as you can see, we have three panelists. We have Anju Kozono, who will be talking about the report that we just issued recently under our Business and Human Rights program, which is on forced labor, the case for a law in Japan banning the importation of products of forced labor and lessons and recommendations for its design. Then we're going to have we'll move this. Jang-Chul Kim, who we call also JC Kim from APL, or Advocacy for Public Interest Law, talking about forced labor in South Korea's global supply chains and advocacy for an import ban. And Laura Murphy from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'll give a more detailed introduction before each speaker. Here are a few rules that we have written down. So there are two things you should know about logistically. So one is you can submit questions, and at the end we'll have a Q&A session, part of the event. So there's a Q&A box. So if you have Zoom in window form, it should be at the bottom. If you have it full screen, it should be somewhere at the top. You can click the Q&A button, and that will bring up a little box where you can submit questions. And another important thing you should know about is for interpretation. So again, in window form at the bottom, you should see a button for interpretation, or in full screen at the top, it may be under the More box. You should see a button for interpretation. Click that, click the language, and we have simultaneous dual interpretation, English and, well, for Japanese, for the English speakers. And then here are a few other rules to know about. So we're going to record this. So we ask that you don't do your own recording, because we're going to do a recording and this will eventually be uploaded to YouTube. So if you'd like to see a recording, we will have a link to the YouTube that you can visit later. And then we do reserve the right if anyone is disruptive to end their participation, but that almost never happens. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker will be Anju Kozono. She's our staff she's our officer for the Business and Human Rights team at Human Rights Now. She's also worked for the Business and Human Rights Resources Center. She's been the coordinator for our project for the Coalition Against Forced Labor and Trade, as part of which we've published 2 significant reports over the last 2 years. Last year's report examined a case study on labor rights involving a violation of supplier factory for the Shimano bicycle company based in Japan, and that explained all the contributing factors to forced labor and supply chains based on failures at every level of the issue, from the bottom to the top of supply chains. This year's report that we are just publishing, that we have just published in English and we are now publishing in Japanese, is going to focus more directly on direct advocacy for promoting a law to ban the importation of products of forced labor. So Anju-san is going to be giving the contents of this year's report in her presentation. So go ahead, Anju-san. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。ヒューマンライツナウでビジネス人権の、担当しております、小園と申します。今日はですね、先ほど、紹介いただいた、新たに、公表したレポートについて、内容を紹介する形になります。レポートはですね、強制労働産品に港を閉ざすということで、日本で、強制労働産品の、輸入の、禁止をするような法律を、導入するべきというようなレポートになっております。先ほど、ちょっとヒューマンライツの紹介をですね、司会のケイロさんからしていただいたので、こちらは、省略したいと思います。で、まずですね、日本の現状というところで簡単に整理をしたいと思います。ご存知の通りですね、日本国内では労働基準法などで、強制労働というものはもちろん禁止されているわけなんですけれども、今回テーマにしているのは、輸出入に関する、強制労働ということで、つまりですね、日本の外で起きている強制労働について、日本が、どのような取り組みをできるかというところが、トピックになっております。日本はですね、貿易ですとか、ビジネスを通じて、海外での強制労働というところに関わっていますので、そうしたところの根絶に貢献できる、貢献できるぞというところを提言しているというのが今回のレポートになっています。 で、その視点でですね、これまで、日本でどのような取り組みが行われてきたかというところですけれども、まず政府による取り組みというところでは、ビジネスと人権に関する、行動計画というものが2020年に策定されています。これはビジネスと人権指導原則に関する指導原則ですね、を日本国内で取り入れるためにですね、促進するために、政府が作った計画という形になっています。で、その他ですね、責任あるサプライチェーンにおける人権尊重のためのガイドラインというものも、政府から発表されております。これも、企業にですね、責任あるサプライチェーン、人権を尊重するような企業慣行を促進するための、ガイドラインというふうになっています。その他、3つ目もですね、責任あるサプライチェーンなどにおける人権尊重のための実務参考資料ですとか、また2023年には、アメリカと日本のタスクフォースという形でサプライチェーンにおける人権尊重及び国際基準の促進に関する日米タスクフォースというものが、できております。で、これ、すべてにおいてですね、努力義務にとどまる枠組みという形になっていまして、そうした観点から、実効性に欠けているというところが指摘されています。タスクフォースにつきましてもですね、2度ほど、ミーティングが開催されたということを報告されているんですけれども、実効的なですね、具体的な取り組みというところには至ってないという点が、こうした、取り組みの、課題という形になっています。で、そうしたですね、国のですね、取り組みの、限界というところが、やはり日本企業の取り組みにも反映されているというところが、見て取れます。一つ参考にしたのがですね、ジェトロが、実施した、調査になりまして、この調査がですね、人権に関する企業のポリシー、そして人権デューディリジェンスを実施しているかどうかというところを調査しています。で、これは2024年度のものになりますけれども、人権デューディリジェンスを実施したと言っていた企業は、回答した企業の中で、16.4% にとどまっていたというところ、実施予定がない企業が44%、それも含めた、現在実施していない企業が、94%という形に、なっております。で、これはですね、回答した企業のうちになりますので、その回答率が33.5%だという点を考えると、実際に、実施している企業はより小さな、パーセンテージになってしまうというところが、あります。こちらがですね、そのデータとなっておりますけれども、人権尊重の、方針、策定公開につきましてはですね、人権デューディリジェンスよりは少し、大きな数字となっておりますけれども、いずれにしてもですね、企業の、取り組みについても、まだまだ、伸びしろがあるというような現状が見て取れます。で、これにつきましてはですね、大企業と中小企業というふうにデータは分かれておりますけれども、やはりここでもすごく大きな差があるというところが見えて取れます。で、日本の、現状はこうした、形になりますけれども、まあ、国、そして、企業、両方のですね、取り組みから見ても、努力義務だけではなかなか取り組みが難しいのではないかというところが分かるんですが、じゃあ世界ではどのような、法律がですね、今、その強制的な法律が、できているのかというところも少し見ていきたいと思います。現在ですね、各国で、強制的な法整備というところが進んでおりまして、例えば、実際に輸入禁止というような措置を、導入しているのがですね、アメリカ、カナダ、そしてメキシコになっておりまして、そして、EU でもですね、2024年に同様の強制労働禁止規則というものが採択されております。それ以外の国でこちらに記載されているのはですね、強制労働ですとか、また現代、奴隷に関するリスクについて、企業に、情報の開示を義務付けるというような法律が整備されているものになります。情報開示と、その輸入を禁止するという措置はですね、少し異なりますので、そちら、米印でですね、分けて、おります。 で、こうしたですね、2種類のですね、強制労働に関する、法整備が各国でありますけれども、日本はですね、G7 の、中で唯一、こうした、両方のですね、法的な措置が、どちらも行われていないというような国となっております。で、そうした措置がなかったら、日本にとってどのような、リスクがあるのかというところも合わせて考えていきたいんですけれども、まずですね、日本の輸入ってどのようになっているのかというところです。輸入の状況を見てみますと、日本は、2023年の時点でですね、世界第3位の、輸入大国と、世界7位の、輸入大国というふうになっております。世界中からですね、多種多様な製品を輸入していることは、皆さんもですね、身近に買い物をしている中でも、感じていることかなと思います。で、特にですね、地理的に近いアジアとの、貿易がもちろん、盛んです。で、一方でですね、アジア太平洋地域というのは、世界の強制労働の被害者の、半数以上が、存在しているとされている地域になっていますので、製造業ですとか農業、鉱物とかですね、漁業に関して強制労働のリスクが高い地域になっています。で、このような地域とですね、深い経済関係がある日本ということなので、知らず知らずのうちにですね、強制労働によって、生産されている製品が、輸入しているということが、極めて、高いと思います。で、その結果ですね、日本の企業、そして消費者がアジア地域における強制労働を経済的に、支援してしまっているという現状が考えられます。さらにですね、強制労働によって、不当に安く、強制労働を使用することでですね、製品の不当に安く生産することができるわけですけれども、そうした、製品がですね、日本に、入ってきているということはですね、労働環境をですね、尊重している日本企業の競争力を、弱めてしまっているということにもつながっています。このようにですね、日本で、規制が導入されておらず、そうした製品が日本に入ってきているというところはですね、倫理的に、問題があるだけではなく、経済的なリスクも負っているという点が注目できるところです。で、輸入禁止措置が、導入されていないことによってですね、他にもリスクが、考えられます。一つにはですね、先ほども、述べたように G7 で、そうした、規則が、ない唯一の国というところですけれども、国際社会の中で期待されている責任を果たせていないという点があります。さらにですね、日本には他国で、他の国でですね、規制がすでにある国で、禁止された製品が、日本に入ってきてしまうということもあります。これが安全な港となってしまうというような言い方をしていますけれども、日本のようにですね、規制が緩い国に、どんどん、そうした製品が流れてきてしまうというのが、問題となっています。で、その結果ですね、先ほども少し説明したように、日本企業、日本の、労働力の、競争力を弱めてしまうということ、そしてですね、さらに、日本からは例えば、部品を、輸入して、それを再輸出して、海外に、送っているということもあると思うんですけれども、日本に製品の部品やですね、その一部が入ってくる際に規制できていない、場合にですね、それを日本から輸出した際に他の、市場で、規制対象となってしまうというリスクも考えられるというところがあります。これはですね、実際のケースとしても、起きていることで、2021年にですね、ファストリテイリングのユニクロのブランドのシャツが、アメリカで、規制対象となってしまったということが、ケースとしてありますので、すでに、こうした経済的な、不利益を被っているというところが、挙げられます。それではですね、そうした中で、日本政府が、強制労働の根絶のためにですね、できる措置というのは複数ある中で、私たちが、まず日本がそうした役割を果たすべきだと考えている理由、そして 輸入規制という措置をですね、取ることでどのような、ことを得られるのかというところも、考えていきたいと思います。まずですね、その日本がそうした役割を果たすべきという観点から言いますと、複数、国際的なイニシアチブに参加しているというところが挙げられます。こうしたイニシアチブではですね、グローバルサプライチェーンにおいて、強制労働撤廃への、コミットメントを日本は掲げておりますので、そうしたコミットメントを、実施するという観点からも、日本がこうした措置を取るべき理由の一つとなっています。さらにですね、日本は、先ほどもアジア地域に、との貿易が盛んというお話をしましたけれども、地理的にもですね、またそうした、貿易が盛んという観点からも、外交的、経済的、そして文化的な影響力を、持つ、国というふうになっております。そうした、立場からですね、この地域の、強制労働に関する、改革をですね、後押しするリーダーシップが求められているというふうに考えています。で、日本がですね、そうした輸入措置を、導入することによって、他の、すでに輸入禁止措置をですね、導入している国との足並みを揃えることもできます。輸入禁止措置はですね、基本的には、その製品が国に入ってこないというふうにするというところまでにとどまっている措置が多いので、例えば禁止された後にもですね、その製品を違う国に輸出したりすることができます。で、こうした、ことが可能な限りですね、規制の抜け道が他の国にあれば、実際に、強制労働を、是正するというところに関しましては、実効性が高めることができなくなっています。なので、各国でですね、たくさんの国で強制労働の輸入禁止措置が、揃わなければですね、実効性が担保できずに、逆に日本でも、そうした措置を、導入することで、他の国との、相乗効果も、狙えるというところが、考えられます。またですね、輸入規制の、導入をすることでですね、人権デューディリジェンスにすでに、投資をしている日本企業にとっても、公平な、競争環境を整えることができるという点も一つあります。このようにですね、輸入規則措置を、導入することで、日本は、えーえーま、企業に対してのインセンティブを高めることもできますし、そして、輸入国、そして、サプライヤー企業に対しての圧力をかけることもできるという観点で、輸入措置を導入するべきだというふうに、報告書で提言をしております。じゃあ実際にですね、今回の報告書でどのような日本での立法を検討しているかというところなんですけれども、まずはですね、アメリカの関税法、307条をモデルにしたものがいいのではないかというところを一つ提案しています。で、このモデルはどういうふうな特徴があるかと言いますと、まず、その強制労働の、輸入禁止措置を発動する、きっかけとなるところですけれども、労働者団体ですとか市民社会団体を含む、外部の組織がですね、そうした申し立てをできるシステムになっています。で、強制労働の疑いがある製品の調査をしてくださいという形で、関税局に申し立てを行って、それをきっかけにですね、その製品の差し押さえ、に向けた調査が行われます。で、もし、そうした調査の後にですね、差し押さえが、行われた場合ですね、その後、差し押さえを解除するための、立証責任を、被るのはですね、輸入業者に転換されるという形で、その輸入業者がですね、強制労働が存在していないことを、証明する必要があるという形です。で、一方でですね、この、モデルにも、多々、課題というものはありまして、そちらも詳しく報告書では、説明をしているんですが、私たちが、日本で検討する際の留意点と、しているところをいくつか紹介したいと思います。で、第一にですね、その、禁止措置が発動解除、するにあたって、透明性を確保するというところが、求められています。 アメリカではですね、その措置がいつ、どのような基準で発動解除されたのかというところが不透明なこともありまして、市民社会側が申し立てを行う際にも、どういった観点から申し立てを行えばいいのか、または企業がですね、輸入禁止措置を受けない対象とならないようにする際にどのような対応をしていればいいのかというのが分かりにくいという課題があります。なので、日本で導入をする際には、適用される立証基準ですとか、判断基準というものを明確にして公表するというところが、重要です。こうすることによって、企業または、市民社会、側がですね、こうした、禁止措置に、対象とならないような、国際人権基準に沿った対応を、取りやすくなるという点が挙げられます。2つ目の留意点としては、調査、そして禁止措置の、発動解除に、関してですね、このプロセスにおいて関税局が市民社会ですとか、ライツホルダーとの、対話を行うことです。これはですね、その、輸入禁止措置がですね、ライツホルダーの、利益にきちんとつながるかどうかということを、担保するためのプロセスになっていて、正当性ですとか、また解除の妥当性を、きちんとライツホルダーの意見を取り入れて、行うというところを求めています。で、この点からですね、差し押さえの、解除に関しては、労働者の、保障ですとか、再発防止対策がきちんと講じられた場合のみ、解除すべきというところも、留意点になっています。さらにですね、日本で、このビジネス人権ですとか、強制労働というところを、担当している、省庁がですね、バラバラだという複数の省庁にまたがってしまっているというところも、一つ課題となっておりますので、日本で、この、強制労働の輸入措置を導入する際には、関税局と連携できる、そして全省庁を代表する形で、一貫した、政策の策定が重要だと考えています。で、これに関してはですね、これだけではなく、加えてですね、人権または労働分野の、専門知識を、持っている人の、採用ですとか、または、この、分野に関する研修を行うことで、こうした、措置自体がですね、自体を行う人たちの、専門性を高めるというところも留意点として挙げています。で、最後にですね、地域的国際的に、連携するというところですが、これは、日本だけではなくて、すでに強制労働禁止措置が、取られているような国との、国際的な連携、そしてアジア地域での、連携をすることで、国、そして、企業とのですね、取り組みを深めていくというところも、留意点として、提言しています。ぜひですね、ケーススタディも多々含めておりますレポートとなりますので、レポートの本文の方も、読んでいただければなと思います。はい、ありがとうございました。
All right, thank you, Kozono-san. Very quickly, I wanted to tell everyone. So our report is available on our website, hrn.or.jp for the Japanese site, and hrn.or.jp/ENG for the English website. On both of those, at the top, you should see an announcement for our report. The title is No Safe Harbor for Forced Labor. Also, very quickly, I want to acknowledge the contributors to this report, the people that actually did the research and writing for it. That would be me and Kozono-san, also our fellow in Japan, Ai Tanaka, and our Geneva fellows, Arya Srivastava and Mary Mam Fai. Those are the people that worked on the report. Next, we have Jongchul Kim, or JC Kim. He's the founder and program director for the Seoul-based NGO Advocates for Public Interest Law, or APL. He's done research on forced labor in the fishing sector with International Organization of Migration. He served as the chair for the Human Rights Department for the Korean Bar Association, and he's won several awards as a public interest lawyer. Human Rights Now has worked with JC and APL for a number of years now on several business and human rights projects, including our first report on forced labor among Korean fishing vessels supplying tuna sashimi to Japan. He's going to speak about the situation of forced labor and supply chains from this perspective of Korea. So go ahead, JC. Thank you.
Thank you for a kind introduction, Kate. I'm very honored to be invited as a speaker at this important event. I'd like to share my slide. Today, I would like to first discuss cases of Korean companies' involvement in forced labor in global supply chains, and then move to advocacy for import ban law as a response. According to a report by the organization Work Free, in 2023, in the total value of goods imported into Korea, which were likely produced using forced labor, was estimated at $200 billion. However, Korean companies' involvement in forced labor goes beyond simply importing such goods. In some cases, they export goods produced with forced labor. In other cases, regardless of import or export, Korean companies are directly involved in the production of goods using forced labor, either abroad or within Korea. I will now go over examples that fall into each of these categories. My interest in forced labor in the supply chains of Korean companies started with cotton. In 2013, I visited Uzbekistan for investigation into the reality of state-imposed forced labor in cotton industry. I went to high school in Tashkent, where I found that the students and teachers were all out in the field harvesting cotton. The classrooms had been converted into dormitories for the student. The students were forced to leave at school and work in the cotton field. The cotton was then imported by a Korean state-owned company and used to produce the banknotes we use every day. In fact, the banknotes we use today are still made using cotton pulp from Uzbekistan. ILO stated that forced labor in Uzbekistan has disappeared. However, according to local NGOs such as Uzbek Forum for Human Rights, forced labor in Uzbekistan cotton industry has not yet been fully eradicated. Korean companies are not only importing goods produced with forced labor, they are also exporting them. One prominent example is sea salt. Since 2014, forced labor involving people with disabilities in salt farm has continued to occur in similar patterns. By similar patterns, I mean like this. Employers deceived people with disabilities and brought them to remote salt farms located on isolated islands. Once there, they confiscated the workers' identification document and subjected them to violence and threats and placed them in debt bondage. The workers were made to labor for long periods without receiving proper wages. I thought, why has this same pattern of abuse persisted for over a decade without being eradicated? One of the main reasons is that the companies using these salt farms as part of their supply chains have never been held accountable for the forced labor that takes place there. That's why in 2022, we filed a petition calling for an import ban on Korean companies exporting sea salt produced with forced labor to the United States. In last April, U.S. Customs and Border Protection issued an import ban against Taepyeong Salt Farm, the largest sea salt producer in Korea. There are also cases where Korean companies produce goods using forced labor, either abroad or within Korea, even when those goods are neither imported into nor exported from Korea. A representative example is palm oil. Many large Korean companies have made direct investment in the palm oil industry in Indonesia. In 2017, I conducted an investigation into a farm plantation operated by a Korean company in Sumatra. Workers there were using a highly toxic pesticide called paraquat, known as gramoson, without any protective gear. Their wages were extremely low, and the production quotas was so high that in order to meet them, workers had to labor not only on holidays, but also bring their family members to help. When I visited the plantation, it was a holiday, but I saw a worker in the field with his young child who was working alongside his father. To eradicate forced labor occurring in the global supply chains of Korean companies, mechanisms such as mandatory human rights due diligence and import ban are necessary. However, such laws do not yet exist in Korea. That is why Korean civil society organizations are actively advocating for creation of these laws. In this second part, I would like to focus mainly on advocacy for import ban. First, I will discuss the opportunities and challenges related to advocacy for import ban, and then briefly outline the key issues concerning import ban legislation. Under domestic laws, forced labor is prohibited. However, one of the problems with the domestic legal framework is that the definition of forced labor differed from that of the international standard. It was only in 2021 that Korea finally ratified ILO Convention number 29 on the prohibition of forced labor. As a result, the convention has become legally binding in Korea, which gives us an important opportunity in the context of advocacy for import ban. The import ban measures by the US on Taepyeong salt, which I mentioned earlier, can also be seen as an opportunity. Although the Korean government initially reacted with resistance following the import ban measure, over time, it began to examine other areas at risk of forced labor. Companies, too, have become more open to the idea of global supply chain regulations, including import ban. Let me give you an example. Just last month, a conference on forced labor import ban was co-hosted by members of National Assembly, the National Human Rights Commission of Korea, and the Korean Bar Association. Some ESG officers from several companies attended the event as part of the audience. Some of them noted that since the import ban measure was issued by US, it was become easier to persuade their CEOs to take steps toward implementing human rights due diligence in their companies. And in June, a mandatory human rights due diligence bill was introduced in the National Assembly. The bill was spearheaded by a lawmaker from the ruling party, which also holds the majority in the assembly. And the parliament member has expressed a strong commitment to passing the legislation. So the introduction of the human rights due diligence bill represents another opportunity in the context of advocating for import ban. Although it is not specifically focused on forced labor, an amendment bill to the Foreign Trade Act that would ban import import from countries committing genocide or crime against humanity was introduced last March by a lawmaker from the Basic Income Party. In the future, we may be able to collaborate with this lawmaker to advance import ban legislation. Of course, regarding import ban laws, the creation and implementation of forced labor import ban regulation in other jurisdictions give us opportunities. However, the discussion around an omnibus package in US that could potentially weaken mandatory human rights due diligence mechanism presents a new challenge for advocacy effort related to import ban. Lastly, one of the challenges in advocating for import ban is the citizen and even some lawmakers suspect these measures are part of the US anti-China policy or a form of trade war through tariffs. Therefore, a strategy to eliminate such suspicions is required. Now, I would like to briefly outline the key issues that arise in advocacy for import ban legislation. One of the key issues related to import ban legislation is whether to create it as a stand-alone law or to amend the existing relevant law, which is the Foreign Trade Act. Another key issue is whether to prohibit only imports or to also ban the export of goods produced with forced labor. After the US imposed the import ban on Taepyeong salt farm in last April, Taepyeong salt products disappeared from the US market. However, Taepyeong salt is still being sold in the Korean market and is also exported to other countries, including Japan. After the US issued the import ban on Taepyeong salt farm, it is reported that Taepyeong salt farm submitted a modification petition seeking the revocation of the import ban measure. Recently, the Coalition Against Forced Labor in Trade, of which Human Rights Now and my organization are members, sent a letter opposing this modification to the US authorities. Our opposition is based on the fact the victims of forced labor within Taepyeong salt farm has not received any forms of financial compensation, including unpaid wages. How to incorporate victim remedy provisions into import ban law is also a key issue. And a burden of proof and standard of proof and whether companies should be notified during the investigation are also key issues. Lastly, a key issue in addressing forced labor is how to make import ban legislation complementary to mandatory human right due diligence. For example, the mandatory human right due diligence bill introduced in the National Assembly includes provisions for designating high-risk areas. So we think the import ban law could also apply a rebuttable presumption standard for the import of goods from such designated high-risk regions under the this mandatory human right due diligence framework. So far, I have shared cases of Korean companies' involvement in forced labor within global supply chains, followed by advocacy for enacting forced labor import ban legislation, focusing on the opportunities, challenges, and key issues. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, JC. Now we can move to our final speaker. Laura Murphy is a senior associate at the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice at Sheffield Hallam University. And during the Biden administration, she was an advisor to the Undersecretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, focusing on issues of forced labor. She's done research on the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, the other U.S. law addressing forced labor in supply chains, and will speak about it in her talk now. Thank you, and go ahead.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Sorry, I jumped up there a second ago. I realized that it had become dark while I was sitting here, so I needed to turn a light on here at my house in New Orleans in the United States. So I just want to thank you all for having me here tonight, this morning, and for inviting me to talk about my experience working with forced labor import bans. I want to say from the start that I agree entirely with the comments that Anju and JC have made, and support very much the efforts you all are making to advocate for forced labor import bans in Japan and South Korea. And I congratulate you. I really applaud the work you're doing, because workers don't get rights without a fight. We have to fight for workers all around the world, and for working on forced labor in supply chains and forced labor in our imports, assist the people who work at the furthest ends of our supply chains and produce the goods we make. But it also, as Anju said, levels the playing field for workers in our own countries who have to compete with unfairly deflated prices of goods that are imported into our countries based on the low price of forced labor, the low price of environmental destruction, all these things that make products made in places where there's unfair competition really hard for the global marketplace. So I really applaud you in the work that you're doing, and I very much support it. Today, I'm going to talk specifically about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is a law that was passed in 2021 in the United States and went into effect in 2022. But it's based on the law that Anju talked about, the Tariff Act. And it's based on that Section 307 that she talked about of the Tariff Act, and that JC talked about using to petition the United States government to ban the products of the salt farm that he was talking about in his presentation. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is based on that Tariff Act, and it was passed by the U.S. Congress. Let me try to change my slide here. There we go. It was passed by U.S. Congress in 2021 because they saw a region where forced labor was imposed by the state and was so ubiquitous as to say, if we're going to ban goods made with forced labor from import into the United States, and in this place, in the Uyghur region of China, in this place, the state has imposed a pervasive system of forced labor on everyone, we can assume that all goods there are made with forced labor, and therefore we should assume that they are banned from importation into the United States. And so we knew, based on any number of documents online, including corporate records, including government records and reports on what they were doing to the Uyghur people and the factories that they were setting up to force Uyghur people into working, and through supply chain tracing, customs records, etc. We knew that these goods were coming into the United States, and Congress determined, after significant advocacy on the part of the Uyghur community and citizens across the United States, and to some extent around the world, to ban the import of all those goods. So you can imagine it if you understand the kind of petition that JC was talking about, to ban the products of that one company that was making salt. Essentially, the United States used the same authority, but with a law, to ban the goods made from an entire region. Now, what happened as a result, and what I want to talk about today, is how that impacted how the UFLPA, what the UFLPA's impact has been. We know that forced labor in the Uyghur region alone affects a huge array of industries. It affects, just looking at the the image I have here, I'm looking at polysilicon being cracked. I'm looking at marigolds being farmed. I'm looking at magnesium being smelted, wind turbines being made, cotton being picked, aluminum alloys being made, apparel, PVC. All of these things are made in the Uyghur region. And I think a lot of people have thought, well, forced labor is so ubiquitous in the world. Even just in China, there's so much forced labor and so many products that are affected. Any law we might pass, we really can't enforce it. And I hear this all the time from people from around the world. They're hesitant, they're anxious about the idea of passing a law that they can't enforce. And the first thing I tell people is, don't forget, we have a law against murder in the United States, among many other things, fraud, counterfeits, etc., right? But think about it. We have a law against murder. We do not catch every murderer. We do not solve every murder as a crime, but we do not throw out the law, right? We do not say the law is ineffective, that we need to completely, just let it go because we can't catch every murderer. We will not catch every import made in the Uyghur region. We will not catch every import made with forced labor coming into the United States, but we will catch some of them, and we will deter many others of them, right? And as consumers, we will know that our government is protecting us from those imports. That's the work that the law does. We can't have an outsized idea of what a forced labor import ban can do as if it's some kind of super law, as if it's different from all other laws that we have in the world. We don't catch every fraud. We don't catch every case of counterfeit. We don't catch every case of drug smuggling. We keep the law in place. We do everything we can to enforce it, and we measure its impact. And so what I want to talk about today is what we can know after just 3 short years, a very short time in the life of a law like this, what we can know about the effect the UFLPA has had in the 3 years. And I will tell you, I'm not representing the US government. I'm not representing any agency. I'm representing my own intellectual assessment as a researcher of how this law has worked. I have a lot of critiques of how we could do it better. I have a lot of ideas about how the law could be refined, and many of them are actually reflected in the comments that Anju and JC made. I think you're absolutely right about how we could do better than what the US law is. We could have more transparency. But I want to talk about what impact we think the UFLPA is having. I think that our measure of impact should not be, does it catch every single import before it gets into the United States? It can't do that. It's not going to catch every single one. But there are 4 measures that I think we should be thinking about. 1, has the US been able to enforce the UFLPA? Has it actually been able to put the people on the ground doing the job to make it work? 2, has the UFLPA changed corporate behavior and increased compliance with the law? Have companies changed as a result of this law coming into effect? And already JC has told us that even all the way in South Korea, companies are changing their strategies to comply. But I'm going to talk about an example in a second that will add to that. 3, has the UFLPA led to negative consequences for companies that don't comply? Is there a price to pay for non-compliance? That's a very big question. And 4, has the UFLPA influenced the rights of the people we're trying to protect? Because it is at heart a human rights law, though it's grounded in trade law. And so what we want to do is ask, does it actually work? Is it helping the Uyghur people? And so that's a much harder question to answer, but I'm going to try to give you an answer. I don't have a ton of time today. I will tell you that I'm publishing a piece on this. It will be actually a series of pieces. And so what you're seeing is like a slideshow with a ton of the information from this report that I'm putting out pretty soon. It's a preview of what's to come. But I'm only going to talk a little bit about what's on the slides, but I put it on the slides because I thought you could read some of this stuff, see it, and maybe I don't have to explain all of it, or I don't have time to explain all of it, but you'll get a bit of the picture. So question number 1, has the UFLPA been enforced by the US government? Has the US been able to enforce it? And the answer is yes. And it's an answer that, I have some hesitancy about. Could it be enforced more? Should more shipments be stopped? Yes. Should there be more entities on the entity list that name specific companies that we know to be the worst of the worst? Yes. It could be enforced more. The US could put more money behind it. But to date, the US government has detained 16,780 shipments valued at more than $3.6 billion across a huge range of sectors. And that range of sectors is really important. If the US government were to stop all of those shipments only in one sector, other sectors would say, we don't have to pay attention very much. And we see this happening in some sectors where they're like, oh, there hasn't been any enforcement against consumer electronics, for instance. So maybe consumer electronics doesn't have to pay attention. And so the variation of sectors that are enforced against is important. And they've hit PVC, apparel, shoes, aluminum, electronics, the solar panels, drones, many products have been stopped. And those industries are, as a result, and I'll say this later, are shifting their supply chain. The United States government also has the right to name specific companies to an entity list that says these specific companies we can prove are really truly using forced labor in the Uyghur region. They absolutely must be stopped. And we have 144 of those companies on the list. And I think that list will grow in the coming months. The thing is that a lot of governments will say, well, we don't have the resources to do this. The United States is very, very rich, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to debate you on that. That is true. However, they had to build this program in 6 months. It was a brand new program. No other government had anything like it. Even the United States did not have anything like the UFLPA. A little bit they did, but not quite. So they built on existing experience. And this is what I think is important, an important message to governments. They worked with the people who stopped counterfeits. They worked with the people who stopped drugs, who stopped other illicit materials from coming into the United States. They worked on that expertise and they said, how can you use your supply chain tracing knowledge? How can you use your expertise to now use this forced labor lens to examine what's coming into the United States? So they didn't start from scratch, and no country needs to start from scratch. Every customs authority is thinking about the imports, where they come from, how they're getting into the country, and what illicit practices might be going into those products. All we need to do is add the forced labor lens. It does cost money, but it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen just by throwing money at it. It happens no matter where you are based on the knowledge you already have. That's question number one. Question number two. I'm going to try to move quickly because I understand we don't have a ton of time. But two, has the UFLPA changed corporate behavior and increased compliance with the law? I think the answer is absolutely, undeniably. We're seeing it all around the world. Not all companies are completely compliant with the UFLPA. But many companies, the vast majority of companies that import into the United States, have done something to try to shift their supply chains to ensure that they are, when they import into the United States, not bringing in anything that has Uyghur, anything coming from the Uyghur region, any import. I'll give you one example that I think is really telling, and that is a study conducted by the BBC, the British broadcast BBC. I don't know what the C is for. But the corporation, the British Broadcast Corporation, BBC, did a report on tomatoes that have been labeled as being from Italy, Italian tomato paste. And they said, okay, let us see if these tomatoes are actually from Italy or if they're from somewhere else. They tested tomato paste from grocery stores across the EU, the UK, and the US. When they did that testing, tomato paste in the EU and the UK that were marked as being from Italy were actually found to be from China. And when they traced those companies' supply chains, they found that that Chinese tomato paste came from Xinjiang, from the Uyghur region of China. So it wasn't all of the tomato paste marked as Italian, but it was some of it. But here's what was interesting. When they tested, they did the same tests for US tomato paste. None of the packages came back positive for Chinese tomatoes. They all came back as Italian tomato paste from some of the very same companies. This means that those companies know which products are tainted with forced labor and which products are not. and they're selling those products that are tainted with forced labor into the markets that have no laws to ban the import of goods made with forced labor. And they are sending the clean stuff to the United States. So when people say, oh, we have to worry about becoming a dumping ground for forced labor made goods if we don't align with forced labor import bans, you're right. That's absolutely true, and we can see it happening. And we've seen this across a large number of industries. If you look at corporate annual reports from companies in the apparel industry, for instance, if they are a Chinese-based company, or even if they're in Asia, Southeast Asia somewhere, they will often say that they have created supply chains specifically to comply with US law. And what they don't say, but which is obviously true, is that everything else, those supply chains are not compliant with US law. Those supply chains are still linked to the Uyghur region. And there's nothing right now that other countries can do shy of passing a law that aligns with this. And you might say that this is US bullying, but I say this is human rights first. This is us thinking about how do we align around the world to say, we believe in supporting the rights of workers around the world. And this saying that we won't import goods, we will not buy goods made with forced labor is one way to do it. And I'll just very quickly go through my other two questions, and we can pick this up in a minute. But has the UFLPA led to negative consequences for non-compliant companies? Absolutely. I've been poring over corporate annual reports from companies that have been named to the entity list. And over and over and over again, you can see a huge decline in their profits when they refuse to comply with the UFLPA, because companies all around the world are saying, we don't want to work with importers around the world are saying, we don't want to work with companies who will not shift their supply chain, who continue to source from the Uyghur region. And we're seeing this in apparel, we're seeing it in PVC, we're seeing it in electronics. And so this is, the companies that continue to use forced labor do pay a price. And I think that's important because it moves investors, it moves corporate elites, and we're seeing more corporations say, you know what, this is too high a price to pay for us to continue using forced labor. We're going to buck the Chinese government system, and we're going to fight back. And I've seen that happen too. There are many cases where companies have several cases. They're not as many as I'd like. Cases where companies are refusing to participate in forced labor programs. And lastly, and I'll do this quickly, but it really deserves much more time. And I hope we'll get to talk about it sometime together. But is it helping the Uyghurs? It is really hard to tell, honestly, because we are not able to go on the ground. If we were talking about forced labor in Malaysia, if we're talking about forced labor in South Korea, talking about forced labor in Chile, we'd be able to go and be able to say, okay, we've talked to the workers. They say it's still not remediated. Oh, we've gone there and they've talked to the workers and they've been helped and they've been, paid their back wages, et cetera. We cannot do that in the Uyghur region. But what we can do is we can see that the Chinese government has, at least rhetorically, started to change their position towards the Uyghurs so that they are creating a sort of legitimized facade for the repression. There's no question that the situation in the Uyghur region is still very dire and that forced labor is ubiquitous. However, we do see changes happening. There's a little bit more freedom of movement. There's a little bit less surveillance. There's a move from arbitrary detention to imprisonment that shows us that the Chinese government is realizing that the international pressure is important. And the changes in the way companies are treating and the treating Uyghur workers and the way companies are adopting forced labor and labor standards protocols in their own companies in China, that matters. And that is changing. And so we are seeing change. It's not overnight. Again, we are not going to see overnight change happen on a crisis this big, but we are seeing change in these 3 years. And I think that's change worth, that makes the law worth replicating. And so I do recommend that international legislative bodies adopt a forced labor import ban that denies entry to all products made in whole or in part with forced labor, that has a rebuttable presumption, as JC talked about, that all products made in the Uyghur region or in other regions with state-imposed forced labor are not allowed entry. And then other, I have other provisions here, but the main idea is that we harmonize this law across the world so that we can say, globally, we do not believe that we, as consumers, as citizens of the world, we do not want to finance or benefit from the products of forced labor. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your time. I'm happy to take questions, and it's really just a delight to be able to talk with you all.
All right, thank you, Laura. That was great. Just very quickly, in our report, we also have a very small section that looks at the problem of state-sponsored forced labor from the perspective of Japan. So you can, that's another good reason to look for our report, No Safe Harbor for Forced Labor. All right,
Yeah.
we have 3 questions. This is now the Q&A session, so if you'd like to submit a question, again, you can do it through the Q&A box, but we already have 3 questions. And one for Laura, one for JC, and one is open. I'll start with the open one. This is from Chatarina Vanessa. Thank you for the insightful presentation. I came from Indonesia, and this question comes up when forced labor in Sumatra was mentioned. I heard the debate on having a dangerous low-wage job is better than having no job at all. But that job is provided by employers who only manage to pay employees limited amounts of wages. So we hear this in debates between workers in Indonesia. She would like to know our view and solution on this issue. So as you were speaking, I actually came up with my own answer that I would like to give, but others can add after this. So the first thing I would like to say is, of course, in Indonesia, forced labor is illegal. So the way I interpret a question like this is, why isn't forced labor legislation being enforced in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand? And so to answer this question, actually last year's report called Addressing Forced Labor in Japanese Supply Chains. If you look up the word Shimano on our website, this will come up as the first hit. So the first 2 chapters really look at why forced labor occurs in supplier countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand. And it talks about the political context in which labor rights aren't being enforced and why they're not being enforced, the political situation. And also in migrant sending countries like Bangladesh and Nepal that are sending migrants, they're also not enforcing protections, of the migrants leaving, and the countries receiving these, like Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, aren't giving them protections, and they're in a very vulnerable position where they have the factories. The basic answer is there's a lot of money involved, and a lot of the political establishment, gets a lot of their power base from this money that's involved. So there are many political incentives for them to even though the law's on the books, they're not enforcing it. They're not passing legal reforms. So there are 2 solutions we talk about in that Addressing Forced Labor report. The first, of course, is but we need to facilitate and support labor advocacy in countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. We need to protect unions and labor rights activists, to put pressure to protect these activists doing this work and facilitate labor advocacy. But the second solution that we talk a lot about that also matches with this is import bans in the countries receiving these products like Japan and the US and the EU also can play a role. And Malaysia is a good example. So in the rubber gloves case, the United States put a WRO, a restriction on the importation of rubber gloves linked to forced labor, and that forced Malaysia into a position to actually reform their labor laws. Under the pressure of losing market access because this is such a huge industry to the American market. And another good example is Thailand. There was a yellow card, basically a warning that fishing products, seafood from Thailand caught vessels would lose access to the EU market, and that forced Thailand to reform their fishing laws to try to better protect. So import bans can also be a positive kind of pressure on these countries. There are also limits that we also, again, talk about in our Shimano report and in our current report, but those are 2 approaches to address this kind of problem. Does anyone else want to add anything about that question? We've talked about developing countries, but what about the perspective from developing countries?
I'd like to add to what Kate answered to the question relating to the debate raised by Vanessa. who mentioned that having a dangerous low-wage job is better than no job at all. I would like to answer in the context of palm oil plantation in Sumatra. The indigenous people have lived in that area for long period of time, depending on the rainforest. But after the rainforest was demolished for plantation for palm oil, they they were deprived of means of livelihood depending on the rainforest. So they could not help but being employed by the multinational companies. So the situation is, like there's no way but being forced to work with low wage jobs. So that is the situation, and this debate also I've keep finding in Korea too, and the employer usually want to justify their exploitation by arguing that it is like kind gesture, or it is because it is kind gesture because they give opportunity for the vulnerable. Without this opportunity, they they are more marginalized in their sending countries. But from our perspective, the vulnerable should be more protected rather than being taken advantage of. So that's my simple answer.
Thank you. Anyone else on that one?
私
Yes.
も
Uh,
少
Go
し、
ahead.
はい。賃金が低い仕事がないよりもいいという話も、今回、その強制労働の、輸入規制ということで、企業とか日本の立場でできることっていうところを考えたときに、例えば強制労働の輸入禁止措置では、それだけではなく、例えば、ビジネス人権に関する指導原則でも、サプライヤーに対しての契約をまず切るというような措置については、最終手段とされていますので、この、ノージョブっていうような、結果になってしまうというのは、そういったサプライヤーとの関係性を切って仕事がなくなってしまうということだと思うんですけれども、それは最終手段だって推奨されているものではないので、まずは、影響力を使って、そのローウェイジジョブというような状況、デンジャラスリーローウェイジですね、という状況を改善するというところが、日本とかですね、輸入をしているような国、そして企業ができるところだと思いますので、この2つが比べられていますけれども、それを比べる前にですね、そのノージョブという状況に陥ってしまう前に、まずはその状況改善をするというのが、日本企業、そしてそうした国ができる、ことかなというふうに思います。
Thank you. If there's anyone else that can answer, they can. Okay. So we can move on to our next question from an anonymous attendee. This is a question for Laura. With reports, I think this is a question actually a lot of people, also the question I had the first time they look at the UFLPA, with reports that Uyghur people are now being moved to other parts of China while continuing to be subject to forced labor and other exploitative situations, to an extent that circumvents the UFLPA. What could be some next steps to strengthen the effectiveness of the law in that context?
Yeah, thanks for asking me that. It is a So just for people who don't know the UFLPA backwards and forwards, the UFLPA has two main parts. One is that the part where CBP can stop any good made in whole or in part in the region of Xinjiang, in the Uyghur region. And then an entity list that allows them to stop goods made by the companies named on that list. So, and those companies are either companies using forced labor to some extent, or sourcing from the Uyghur region. So if a Uyghur person is moved out of the Uyghur region to Jiangsu, let's say, to another part of China, the goods made by that company can't be stopped by CBP when they're being imported under the rebuttable presumption, as we've mentioned before, under the law. However, if we name that company to the entity list, those goods can be stopped. However, the entity list is slow in adding companies. There aren't that many companies, and there are many, many companies across China using Uyghur forced labor. And so this is a problem. It's a problem that I don't think Congress contemplated. I think Congress thought that the way that they wrote the law, and in fact, I know some of the people who wrote the law, I think they thought that the language they had used in the law allowed CBP to stop goods made by any company using Uyghur forced labor. But this points to a really serious issue. Like, when governments do create these laws, they have to be extremely careful in how they write them. And I'm always happy to chat with anyone and give technical assistance on what things are missing from our law, or what things like lawyers will tell us in the US. They'll say, oh, well, yeah, maybe Congress meant that, but that's not what the law says. And so we can only do exactly this. I'm happy to go through every single one of these tiny little problems with the law and help to fine tune it so that we can have the best laws around the world. In terms of like improving the UFLPA, I will say that I think that it's dangerous to tinker with it too much, because if we try to amend the UFLPA, there might be very powerful corporate lobbies that will try to undo the entire law. And so there's some significant hesitance in messing with something that's working, even if it's not working entirely. If I had my druthers, I would add any company using Uyghur forced labor in any way. I would add a number of commas and semicolons and verbs. Once you start to try to actually implement a law, you realize how much of it is a grammar lesson, how much of it is about really picking apart, and all of the lawyers in our meeting today will understand this, picking apart every single word and making sure it's defensible if it were ever to come to a trial. But what I'd say is, like, the most important thing we can do, given the law that we have, is naming more entities into the list. And what that would require is honestly, more resources for the teams that do it. That said, that group is doing that work on a shoestring. The group of people who do the entity list got no money whatsoever. And so they're doing it without any money, with borrowed time, with borrowed resources. And so again, I want to emphasize that governments who are anxious about, do we have enough money? Can we really do it? If you have the will, if you have the political will and the real concern about this issue, you can make it happen. But you can make it happen only within the confines of the law as it's written, which sometimes becomes an impediment to doing everything you want to do. It's not a satisfying answer, but that's the truth.
Right, thank you for that. in our report, we were thinking a lot about using, Section 307 and the UFLPA as a model. So we have a lot of thoughts about, that's why we spent a lot of attention in
Yeah, I
not
see
to
that.
just lift it completely, but to think about, what are some of the good things, what are some of the bad things, and how can we put this in Japan context? We thought a lot about that. So
And I'll tell
that's
you that I am, like I will reiterate, I am happy to nerd out about that stuff all day. Like I I have many critiques of the UFLP. I think it's a very strong and important law. I think the Tariff Act is very important. And I truly believe that we should have a law. And hey, Indonesia, the new trade agreement, arrangement, whatever, has some provisions for introducing an import ban and collective bargaining, both of which are super important. But we need to get, and this is part of the answer to your question, workers need to be in the room doing the conversations about how that happens and what matters to them about having those structures in place so that it's not a US imposition. It's actually something that folks on the ground in Indonesia can say, we've been asking for this all along. Let's work together to make it happen.
that was a really big thing when the US put in its trade agreement with Indonesia, this provision. I'm really hoping that this sets a precedence and, if they ever come back to Japan and any country, that they're pushing this. That was a big deal, I thought.
I do too, but we need to make sure that it's not, again, it's not an imposition by the US, that it is
Right.
something that we immediately organize around and have people on the ground saying, we believe in this, even if we didn't ask for it in this particular way. And this is what we want it to look like.
Mhm. I agree with that too. So we have this third question for JC, and he has answered it by text. I think, is that satisfactory? Do you think you need to add anything verbally, JC, or do you think the text answer is we can leave it at that?
Yeah, is for time constraint. Please read my text message, and my answer is bit positive at this time because this current government is more labor friendly, and newly appointed Minister of Labor is the former trade union leader. So yeah, it's high likelihood for us to have the bill to be passed.
Okay. And that's for
Thank you.
mandatory human rights due diligence in
Right,
Korea,
not
right?
import ban. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really great that South Korea has this positive environment, because right now in Japan, what's called the Japan First Party, which is very Trump-like kind of party. It's different, but that kind of insular nationalist got big gains. So there's a shift in the opposite direction in Japan, which is a little depressing for legislation like this. But this is all the more reason for us to be doing this kind of advocacy and putting these arguments out there. All right. Well, let me just end. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists for those wonderful presentations. That was terrific.
I learned a lot. Thank you.
And like I said, this is part of our advocacy effort for passing this kind of legislation in Japan. So we hope that this has walked through a lot of the arguments and why this kind of legislation is important and why we need it, not only in Japan, but hopefully the mantra for our movement is no safe harbor. So we want this passed in every country, so that forced labor really has no safe harbor in any country, and we just go down the list. But Japan is a big player for reasons that Anju spoke about. So thank you everyone for coming. I want to share one last slide. Okay, so I need to go to share screen, which is now at the bottom of the screen. Share. All right. So these are ways that you can participate. You can take a screenshot of this to use these later, but the top one, and to also explain for the English speakers, we're doing a campaign to advocate for the recognition of Palestine as a state by the Japanese government. So if you want to sign that petition and be a part of that movement, you can go to the top Q code. And then the bottom one is about becoming a monthly supporter. There are some advantages to becoming a monthly supporter. It says here 33 yen, which is about 50 cents a day. You can become a monthly supporter. And we have a newsletter, and there are some other perks that you can read about if you go to the bottom Q code. And again, thank you for joining, everyone. And that is the conclusion of our event. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.